The environment in which the slave girl is raised is one of terror and licentiousness. Her teachers are her owner and his son's whipping and derogatory remarks. She starts getting gifts from her master, his sons, the overseer, or possibly all of them when she is 14 or 15. She is whipped and starved into submission to their will if they don't succeed in their goal. It's likely that each circumstance affected why these ladies decided to mistreat slaves intimately. Maybe some of them were just bored or frustrated down there. However, it's possible that, at least subliminally, intimately abusing slaves was a way for them to make up for their lack of control in other areas of their lives. But what of intimate relations between planter-class white women and slave men? Under what conditions did they occur? How should they be described in terms of power, agency, and consent? Answering these questions involves analyzing historical records through the lens of power relations, parsing through the complexities of racial, class, and gender hierarchies. There is plenty of proof that white slave owners and black women engaged intimate encounters in the antebellum South, ranging from coerced to what seemed to be rather harmonious romantic relationships. Although they were much less common, personal relationships between white women and African slave men did exist. This study examines the variables that contributed, or may have contributed to the prevalence of intimate encounters between affluent white women and slave men, the power dynamics that underlie them, and their consequences for intimate consent. It does so using an intersectional socio-historical perspective. The study illustrates how these relationships were maintained by upper-class white women who used intimacy as a tool of power to uphold both patriarchy and white supremacy. For black men and women, slavery was an equally devastating experience. Both were torn from homeland and family. Both were forced to perform grueling labor, subjected to mental and physical degradation, and denied their most basic rights. Enslaved men and women were beaten mercilessly, separated from loved ones arbitrarily, and, regardless of sex, treated as property in the eyes of the law. White women's sexuality was heavily regulated by law as well as by culture. Adultery was considered a greater offense for women than for men, and was punished more harshly. Similarly, giving birth out of wedlock was considered much more of a social problem for white women than for anyone else. The Southern way of life, and the institutions that defined it, white supremacy, slavery, and the planter aristocracy, were inextricably linked with the sexual regulation of women, especially upper-class women, the purity of white women, when contrasted with the sexually lascivious black Jezebel archetype, served to highlight the alleged superiority of white womanhood, and by extension, whiteness. If plantation mistresses could live above reproach, their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers could boast of the superiority of their civilization. The sullying influence of slavery must not touch the women of the upper class lest the entire structure crumble. Coupled with the notion of elite white female intimate virtue was that of white female vulnerability, the idea that plantation wives and daughters needed to be protected, defended, and sheltered. Framing women in this way served as a means of patriarchal control. White women whose affairs with slaves were made known faced varying degrees of public humiliation. When a planter's daughter or wife was discovered to be pregnant by a slave, great pains were taken to cover up the pregnancy. The resulting child might have been sold into slavery, but infanticide was not an uncommon means of avoiding scandal. Indeed, planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands. Their freedom and mobility was severely limited. For example, they were generally not allowed to travel without an older male chaperone. Spousal abuse was often considered a legitimate method for men to control their wives. Clinton calls Southern plantation mistresses prisoners in disguise. This is undoubtedly an exaggeration, but the fact remains that upper-class white women, whatever luxuries their privileged race and class status afforded them, faced a unique set of limiting patriarchal dicta. Indeed, in private, many plantation women were unhappy with their lack of freedom and the expectation that they remain dutiful, obedient, pleasant, and cheerful while their husbands had affairs with or forced female slaves. Knowing that the mixed-race slave children who surrounded them were their husbands' offspring was both humiliating and heartbreaking. Southern women, who generally married at a younger age than those in the North, not infrequently at 15 or 16 years old, were often left abandoned on plantations while their husbands traveled for business, pleasure, or military duty. The life of a plantation mistress was often lonely and sad. The fact that affairs between planter-class women and slaves were relatively uncommon is unsurprising. White women in the South were sexually restricted as compared to their male counterparts, and 19th-century contraceptive techniques were not nearly effective or accessible enough to ward off the possibility of pregnancy. Still, intimate contact between white women and black men did occur in slaveholding societies, more often than perhaps many are aware. The following is a list of factors that did or may have contributed to the incidence of such relations. The dangers of having intimate relations with a black man rather than a white man were enormous in terms of the possibility of producing a mixed-race child. However, although birth control and termination methods in the 19th century were not as widely used, safe, or accessible as they are today, they existed. Condoms made out of animal skin, membrane, oiled silk, and rubber were used along with other contraceptive techniques to prevent pregnancy. There is also a possibility that affairs between white women and slaves were simply not noticed or recorded as often as they occurred. While it may have been expected, to a certain extent, that white men would transgress morally, for example by having intimate relations with slaves, a white woman choosing to have intimacy with a black man might not have been considered a likely occurrence. Additionally, an upper-class woman under suspicion of an affair with a slave could readily invoke images of chastity in order to allay trouble for herself, or in other words, accuse the slave of rape. Because black men, like black women, were seen as inherently lustful and prone to sexual vice, for an elite woman to have illicit intimacy with a black rather than a white man might have been a slightly safer bet. It was easier to blame a black man of rape than a white man. Why these women chose to intimately abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or frustrated. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. White women whose affairs with slaves were made known faced varying degrees of public humiliation. When a planter's daughter or wife was discovered to be pregnant by a slave, great pains were taken to cover up the pregnancy. The resulting child might have been sold into slavery, but infanticide was not an uncommon means of avoiding scandal. The fertility of enslaved women was examined by owners to make sure they were able to birth as many children as possible. Secretly, slave owners would impregnate enslaved women, and when the child was born and grew to an age where he could work on the fields, they would take the very same children, of their own blood, and make slaves out of them, as pointed out in the National Humanities Center Resource Toolbox on Slaveholders' Abuse of Slaves. It was common for the slave to be subordinate to the master, even men with enslaved males. It was part of the enslaved man's function as an animated tool, an instrument of pleasure. Enslaved women were forced to have intimacy with their owners, but their masters considered this a favor. White men often claimed they were doing black women a favor by saving them from having intimacy with black men who were considered to be animalistic and brutal. When enslaved males turned 15 years old and younger in some cases, they had their first inspection. Boys who were underdeveloped had their manly materials castrated and sent to the market or used on the farm. Each enslaved male was expected to get 12 females pregnant a year. The men were used for breeding for 5 years. One enslaved man named Bert produced more than 200 offspring, according to the slave narratives. To combat the high rate of death among the enslaved, plantation owners demanded females start having children at 13. By 20, the enslaved women would be expected to have 4 or 5 children. As an inducement, plantation owners promised freedom for enslaved female once she bore 15 children, according to Slavery in the United States by John Simkin. If the enslaved woman was considered pretty, she would be bought by the owner and given special treatment in the house, but often subjected to horrifying cruelty by the master's wife, including the beheading of a child because he was the product of an enslaved master affair. We may be 5 to 6 generations removed from the horrors of slavery, but the trauma of enslavement has been carried by African Americans. Thanks for watching. To support, please subscribe to our channel and give us a comment. See you in the next video.